Today I'm going to be demonstrating the last half of this painting of a butterfly in acrylics. Hi, Shanna Rowe Jackson here from Caution Arts That Play, and welcome to part 2 of this demo of me painting a butterfly in acrylics. If you missed part 1, I'll put a card pop-up for you. Basically, part 1 covered how I did the blurry background without using an airbrush, as well as a few other tips and tricks with acrylic paint. In this part 2, I am going to cover the final details, as well as a couple of different techniques such as glazing and dry brushing and when it's good to use them and when it is not. But before I get into all that, I would like to mention, if you are not already following me on social media, my social media links can be found in the description below. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. So if you are somebody who is interested in seeing more of my art and seeing it updated more regularly, please feel free to go to the description below and follow along with me on those social media sites. So basically right now what I am doing is I am going over part of the background with a glaze. And sometimes when I do glazes, I use just some water, or sometimes I use Liquitex glazing medium, which I will show you later on in the video. As I mentioned in my previous video, I went over that background with a glaze of green to try and get those colors to pop, and you can kind of tell that it really helped. Because when I first did the background, I had done pretty much a tint. I had done a little bit of dry brushing over it, and I had lightened it up quite a bit with white, and it made it too pastel, and I wanted those colors to be vibrant because this picture that I'm doing it from was taken on a really bright sunny day. So I wanted my colors to be as vibrant as possible. So basically I took my base color of green and I mixed it with Liquitex glazing medium, and I put it right back over the green and the black, and it made those colors pop a lot. Glazing is a great technique, and it is really useful in a lot of different ways. Like I said, you can use it with water or you can use it with a glazing medium, and I go back and forth depending on the technique that I want. I find I have more of a glossy finish when I do it with my glazing medium, and sometimes it can be a little bit more even. So when I want something to really pop, I usually use the glazing medium instead of water. But if I just want to alter the color of something optically by glazing, then I will take one color and dilute it really well with water and go right over another color with it. And that will help mix the colors optically without making it pop too much. It's pretty much just altering the color. So both techniques can be done interchangeably. Like, I use both techniques in a piece, but they both work for different ways, and they're good techniques either way. I know some artists who never even use glazing medium and just use water, and that works fine too. I just like the glazing medium, like I said, because it gives me that extra sheen and pop. But if you're somebody who likes your paint to just be matte, then water is probably a better choice for you. So right now I am blocking in the shadows and the base color for the red leaves behind my butterfly. And in this, I'm actually kind of using a glazing technique as well, where I am laying down, in a lot of it, I laid down the veins of the leaves first, and then I watered down my base color, and then just put that right over the blank canvas. So you can glaze without even having a color underneath. So that was a way to glaze too. So basically what glazing is you are taking a color and you're making it more transparent, and you're putting it down on your surface, whether you're putting it over another color so it can mix optically, or you're just punching up a color, or you're putting it right directly over your support without anything underneath. It's basically just making your colors more transparent. And some colors are already transparent enough that you don't even need to really add any water, or at least not much water or glazing medium, in order to get them to do that. And glazing gives you a different dimension of color, and it's hard to show in a photograph, but when you see something that has been glazed in person, it just gives you so many layers. It's a great way to layer things. For instance, if you were to do an underwater piece and you had a mermaid underwater, you would want to take the watercolor and glaze it over the mermaid, because that's going to push her back and make the illusion of her being underwater more accurate. So there's many ways that you can use glazing. Same thing with if you're doing a landscape and you're doing a mountain scene and you want to push the mountains back. A great way to do that would be to glaze some of the sky color over the mountains, and it would push them back into the distance. So there's many ways that glazing is really useful. So as you can see, I am starting to put the veins in on that side leaf there. This is another leaf that it was actually a little bit blurrier in the original photo, but I wanted to punch it up a little bit and make it more crisp. So basically what I am doing is I'm just putting harder edges in there and making everything a little bit more clear. This takes some imagination and some knowledge of what leaves look like. And if it's something like, I've painted a lot of leaves and I've drawn a lot of leaves and I've observed a lot of leaves in my time, so I'm able to do that. But it also is helpful if you are working on something like this to take more than one reference photo of what you're working on, and then if you want to be able to change something, you can use your other reference photos to look at just to see other ways of looking at the subject. So what you just saw me do is where I added the white. That was actually a dry brushing. So I don't recommend dry brushing for many things other than detail or basically lightening things up. I don't recommend dry brushing for something as your subject. For instance, if you are painting trees, I don't recommend you just using a dry brush to do the leaves. I don't think that adds enough dimension. I don't think it adds enough realism. If that's the style you're going for, then that's fine. But when you're working in realism, dry brushing as a subject can be a little flimsy for a technique, I guess. It just doesn't give you, I don't know how to explain it. It's just not vibrant enough for me, I guess. What I use dry brushing for mainly is if I want to make something look shiny, that works really well. Like for instance, these leaves. I had taken a base color and I put it down and then I wanted to lighten it up. So I brought a dry brush over it with white, and I usually only ever dry brush with white, I think, honestly, when I'm doing highlights and things like that. And it kind of gives it almost a powdery look, which I wanted for this leaf, because this leaf is actually the underside of a leaf. So you know how the underside of a leaf is always a lighter color, lighter version of the top side of the leaf? Well, dry brushing worked great for that technique. I put my base color down and then I dry brushed white over it, and it gave it that kind of powdery light look that I needed. Dry brushing is great for certain textures, and it actually worked really well for this leaf. And you'll see later on the red leaf, I'm going to use a lot of dry brushing to do the highlights. So I normally only ever dry brush over another color. And it's really just to create texture and to create, certain effects such as highlights or waxiness, or it basically is just another way to create detail for me. I never use dry brush as a subject on its own. And that goes for even clouds. Even with my clouds, I don't dry brush my clouds on, and unless they're just small wispy details around the clouds. But the main clouds themselves are actually painted in. They're not dry brushed in. But again, everybody has their own routines. Like I said, I think dry brushing has a place. I know some artists who would never even use dry brushing at all because they've seen it overused. But I think that every technique has a place, and I have found ways to use each of these techniques in my own art that work, but it might be different for your art. You might like the look of dry brushed clouds or brushed trees, and that's totally fine. That is perfectly fine. I'm just speaking for my own style and the way I do things, because I do think that dry brushing definitely has a place, and I use it quite a bit. One place that I like to use dry brushing is if I am painting water and the water is really dark, but you have certain reflections of the sky. I might dry brush the colors of the sky over the dark water, and that creates a really great shimmery effect. It also works really well for creating the illusion of fog in a landscape. And like I said, in places where there's highlight, you'll see me do that on this leaf that I'm working on now. So basically what I'm doing, because this leaf is actually a really dark leaf, but it's a waxy leaf. So it's it's dark, but it's going to reflect the sun a lot. So what I'm doing is I'm putting in the dark color first as my base color. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to start dry brushing some of the white on there. And right there, I accidentally put a little too much white. That was not a dry brush. That was basically a wet brush. That was a very wet brush. It had too much paint on it. So dry brushing is when you take a dry brush and you have very little paint on it. And as you can see, I'm just starting to dry brush that waxy kind of texture on there with my white. And I'm coming back through and I'm putting the veins back in with my original color. And that part down at the bottom, I left dark because that's actually going to be in shadow, and I'll work on that after. And I'm not going to leave it like this. I'm going to put multiple layers because most things do have multiple layers because they're three-dimensional. So I want this to look as three-dimensional as possible. So I put that light layer down, and now I'm coming up with an even brighter layer. Still dry brushing, but with just a tad bit more paint than my original layer. And then I'm coming back through again, and I am putting more veins in. And I actually come through with a little bit of that red later on, and I dry brush over parts of the white to make it look a little bit more, just to give it more detail and bring some of that red back in, because not all highlights are even. So there's going to be some red showing through in parts of the highlights, brighter reds that end up showing through in parts of the highlights. So that's what I end up doing there. And I even end up coming through, I think, and glazing a bit more of that red color in parts of the veins to make them look more moist. Because if you look at a leaf, even when a leaf is dry, the veins hold moisture in them. Like if you were to take a leaf and break open the veins of a leaf, you're going to see moisture. So generally speaking, even when a leaf is dry, the vein parts are going to look a little bit moister than the rest of the leaf. And so when I come through later on, I'm going to use a glaze, and I'm going to use my glazing medium because that is a little bit more shimmery, like I mentioned before, and it's going to make those veins look a little bit more damp and just add a little bit more of that realism to them. And you can see there, I'm putting more of the higher highlights now. So now my brush is a little bit less dry than it was. And I will alter this. I keep going back and forth. It's just about layering until you get it to the point where you like the look. So I'm adding some of the white into my shadow area because, like I said before, you want shadows, like I said in my first part of this demo, you want your shadows to have life in them. So shadows are not always completely dark. There is going to be some light reflecting, just not as much, because you just have something blocking the light. There's going to be radiant light coming through into that shadow. And so that's why I added some lighter parts in the leaf there. And it gave some detail because there are veins in that shadow. And you want to be able to depict stuff like that. So I'm going around my edges and I'm sharpening them up. And I am just going back and forth, and if you see, now you can see that I'm glazing a little bit of that red like I talked about, just to kind of punch it up a little bit. Apparently that is my phrase of the day, punching it up. And now I'm going through in the leaf that is in front of it, and this is mostly going to be in shadow. And you see I just put some of that red there because that's the part of the leaf in the middle that is brighter for some reason because the light is shining through. And so what I did was I put some of that magenta-y color, then I put white over it for the light, and then I glazed the magenta back over it, and it gave it that feeling of light shining through. And it's warmer, so it also gives that feeling of light shining through in the shadow area. And a lot of my shadows I glazed. Generally speaking, you want your shadows to be thinner than your highlights. And so it's best to build them up with glazes as opposed to have thick paint. And I spoke somewhat about that in my first video as well, because you want anything that is going to be physically thicker to be what comes forward because of like the way our eyes work. Generally speaking, anything that is actually literally thicker on the canvas is going to stand out more than anything that is thinner. So thinner paint should be in the back, thicker paint should be forward, and you always want your highlights to come forward instead of the shadows. And even then, I'm not putting thick paint on pretty much any part of this. Even on my highest highlights, I like to have thin layers of paint because I'm not doing impasto techniques in this painting. So I don't need my brush strokes to really stand out. But I do have probably more layers of paint in the foreground than I do in the background. Or thicker layers, I should say. I have multiple layers in my background as well, but they tend to be thin layers. And I'm just going through and putting the detail in. So when I'm working on a leaf, I am still kind of breaking it down piece by piece because it can become daunting to try and do a whole leaf while looking at the whole leaf. There's a lot of little parts to a leaf, and you don't have to get them perfect because it's nature, and nature isn't perfect. But it is good to pay attention to the patterns on the leaves and to pay attention to the directions of the veins in the leaf and things like that. If one little vein is off, nobody's going to know the difference, but it does help to just break it down piece by piece. And that's what I'm doing with my butterfly as well. Right now, I am getting ready. I'm putting in the detail of the butterfly with a fine liner, and I'm not using black. I am using, I want to say it's raw umber mixed with black, but it's not pure black. And all this detail is going to get covered up in a few minutes because I'm actually going to glaze my orange over it. And that is because I want to have the layered look in my wings. Because I could have just painted the whole thing orange and then gone through and repainted. But what this does is, it makes it so that I can see my lines better. Because I could have glazed over my pencil marks, but I really didn't want to do that. So it wouldn't be as easily seen. So this is holding a place for all my detail, but it's also going to add a dimensionality that it wouldn't if I didn't do this technique. Because if you look at a butterfly's wings, it looks different in the light. So if you're looking from, it depends on what angle you're looking at, but you can see all these different shimmery colors, all these different, I don't know how to explain it. Just these different dimensions of color in a butterfly's wings. And I kind of wanted to capture that, and I figured layering this way would help capture that. So I just glazed my color right over it, and I didn't actually use a ton of glazing medium with that, but I had actually mixed that color from the yellows that I've been using and from the magenta I've been using, and a little bit of, what color was it? Yellow ochre, which I've also been using in the background. So instead of grabbing a pre-made orange, what I did was I mixed in orange from the colors I've already been using in the background. So even though this orange is going to contrast with all the colors around it because their complementaries or near complements are near it, it's also going to be tied together with the rest of the background because the base colors for that orange were already in the painting. So that just kind of creates a cohesiveness. So anytime you can mix your colors from colors you're already using, it's really helpful just to create a cohesive look. And if you look, I'm going right back over those details, again, not with pure black. And for the body, I'm doing actually a bluish green because this little fella has like an iridescent look, and in the sun, he is reflecting all kinds of beautiful colors in his body. So I put that as a base color because those colors actually show up in his body. And I'm just putting the detail around his wings, and later on, you can probably tell, I end up changing his wings a little bit. I don't end up doing it in the video, but I end up straightening that wing that's on the left side out a little bit because even though it looked like that in my reference photo, it didn't translate well to my painting, so I decided to take some artistic license later on and fix that. It is always okay to alter what you see in your reference photo if it makes a better painting. Just because it's a photo doesn't mean it's perfect. You should always be looking for ways to improve on your references. And so I'm just going through and putting in those little details. Again, I'm working little by little. I'm focusing on certain little spots at a time because I don't want to get overwhelmed, especially with the amount of detail in the butterfly and with how small it is. This is only an 8x10 piece, so it's very difficult to get in and get all those details, even with a liner brush. And even then, it's not as crisp as I would like. But I'm just going through and working on that body. The body has a lot of fur on it, and the way that I made it look furry is I didn't put in a ton of little furs because it wouldn't look right with as far away as the butterfly is. What I did was I kind of outlined it a little bit with some white as you can see there, and that gave the impression that there was some white furs around it. So there's little tips and tricks you can do. Like I said in my previous video, art is pretty much an illusion. There's just tricks that trick your mind into thinking you're seeing something that your mind already knows about, like the fur on the body of a butterfly. All right, and this is my finished piece. Prints are available on my print site if anybody is interested. That's linked in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, please hit subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.